Ex-prisoners of Reddit, what was the worst thing you saw inside the prison walls? English female prison. I saw a woman get held down by two others, while a third woman proceeded to shove her hand up the woman's vagina to check if she had came in with a parcel. Drugs. This was in the communal showers, so yeah, addicts don't give a fuck. I saw a guy get in a fight with his cousin over a 50-cent bowl. This escalated more and more until they starting fighting. We all kinda watched out the corner of our eyes. BC it was in the cell while the doors were open. Well, the guy that was pissed about the bowl grabbed the dude by the hair and bite a huge hunk of his cousin's eyebrow off, like about half of it. If that wasn't bad enough, me and my cellmate moved into the cell. BC it was further away from the TV. So we are cleaning up the cell and my cellmate goes, holy fuck, look at this. He lifts up what I thought was a dead hairy bug. Nope. Furry ass eyebrow and skin. Doesn't haunt me, just crazy to think a guy lost half an eyebrow over a fucking 50-cent bowl. It's not the craziest thing I saw, but it's a social norm in prison that goes on daily. I'll never forget how socially acceptable jackers were. Like somebody would be wearing a coat or hood etc and stare at a female CO and jack off. Sometimes sitting on a bench, sometime the TV room, and nobody bats an eye. One time a dude was like, hey man, can you move a row over? She know I'm watching, and didn't skip a beat, cranking off to an ugly 60-something years old woman. It's fucked up, but after a while you just accept that some people went nuts in there. Saw someone break a small branch off a tree in the yard, dry it out in the sun, sharpen it down to a point on the concrete, and then stab a guy in the back with it 4 times. He had to be airlifted to hospital because it punctured his lung. I spent 6 years in prison. 1 month in I watched a crip on crip gang stabbing. They stabbed the guy 60+ times while he was curled up in a ball screaming help. But nobody could because he'd be a target next. He somehow survived, but I couldn't tell you how. I think about it every day. I remember people kinda turned on each other out of boredom. I mean, you made friends and all, but you had it hanging over you that you were a bad guy, and some people took to being assholes and provoked others seemingly out of boredom. It was an unpleasant situation to be on the other side because you wanted to stay out of trouble too, but at the same time had to stand up for yourself. Maybe not the absolute worst I saw, but something I remember. Kettle line was horrible, and I saw it at least 10 times. People would lose an argument, fight, or just get embarrassed by someone and go back to their cell, fill a kettle up with water mixed with sugar, boil it and then throw it in the perpetrator's face. The sugar made the water like napalm, and it would stick to them. I saw 4 people hang themselves. 1 person slit his wrists and fall through the cell door when it opened in a massive pool of blood. Many people cut themselves with razors as a way to get things they want. And 1 person in the segregation block smear shit all over his cell, then cut himself over and smear the shit into his cuts. Also people throwing buckets full of piss and shit over others. I saw a pool ball thrown at a guy's face and break his nose and jaw. I was a prison buddy, which is a information giver / counselor. This was all in 3 years and I'm grateful every day I wake up that I'm not still in there. I spent 8 years in prison in the state of Georgia. There was a guy who made a hustle of hiding illegal cell phones for the Mexican gangs. When a shakedown / search occurred, this man was responsible for the loss of many of those cell phones. He was confronted on the yard and tried to escape by climbing the fence. He got stuck in the razor wire, shredding his forearms, while 7 or 8 Mexican gang members were stabbing him all in the back of his legs and his ass. While not prison and certainly tame by comparison, the worst thing I saw in jail was refusal to allow people to use the restroom. We, 6 of us, were all waiting 12 hours for processing in a small town in NC and were put in a concrete cell with a toilet. Every time we stood up to use the toilet, an officer would yell at us to sit back down. For those who disobeyed, they were forcibly handcuffed and moved somewhere else, often pissing themselves during the ordeal. Saw this in a similar post. Some guy was doing a 2-year stretch for something. Anyway, he was laying awake his first night when he heard the microwave. He didn't think much of it and ignored it. Then a few minutes later he hears this blood-curdling scream. Apparently the guy using the microwave heated up a tub of Vaseline to boiling point, then he pours it on some guy's face. I think it was revenge for the guy talking smack about him. Saw a dude get his face turned to hamburger over a card game. Dude lost, so he sucker punches the guy across from him a minute later, gets on top of him, and probably get about 10 hits in by the time the co broke it up. Blood everywhere. I was like, holy fuck. It was like my first month there, and it made me kinda not wanna leave the cell. My bunkie was a blood, and Jacked has like, dude, nobody will fuck with you. I'm like, okay, I hope not. I'm pretty sure he smashed his eye socket in. Cool story. I was a small time criminal in my youth. Got locked up for some weed for the weekend. I never experienced much kindness that I could remember from people, but I did in jail. I couldn't use the bathroom in my cell because I was too scared, and these guys started talking to me and distracting me so I could go. It was the strangest and coolest thing I'd ever seen. Been intrigued by behavior ever since. No, an ex-prisoner, but I was in a holding cell for a few hours. Long story involving alcohol and fighting outside a pub. The way out, an older man was having a stroke. His pained cries for help were met with shut the fuck up, or I'll give you a rein to need help, and in sick of hearing you. He lived has some pretty bad brain damage. One of the officers never returned to that line of work. Not a prisoner, but worked in a prison clinic for a few weeks while in med school. Was under the mentorship of the prison GP. Had this one guy come into the clinic for a routine visit who had a colostomy. We did our physical, blah blah, and the guy was about to leave. The GP mentoring me said, hey, check out his colostomy real quick. The guy awkwardly peeled part of his bag off, and he has these red blisters weeping fluid around his colostomy stoma. I was totally confused, and the guy left super quick. GP just shrugged. Later that day, I asked the GP what was up. Apparently the other prisoners fucked that guy's colostomy hole, and he had gotten herpes of the colostomy from the other prisoners. Haunts me to this day. I was a prison guard, briefly, at an all-male prison in Virginia. It didn't suit me. I don't have enough testosterone, I guess. I just didn't like the entire process. I also couldn't get used to walking around on my own with 180 men. When I did rounds, the men were loose, just walking around watching. The stares were penetrating. If any of those guys grabbed me, I had no gun, no mace, nothing, and Virginia prisons will never negotiate with prisoners for the sake of a hostage. I'd have been screwed. It messes with your head a bit, but I still did it. Yeah, the food's gross, but the place was clean. The worst day for me was when one of the guards blew his brains out in the watchtower. He was in his early 20s. Coworker of mine here in Delaware during a riot got his teeth stomped in, and while he lay there bleeding, some of the dudes on death row surrounded a female guard and protected her from all the other dudes who wanted to rape her. Honor among thieves, how about it? They actually got their sentences reduced, I believe. Not the worst, but I hope it's uplifting. Not exactly prison, but how about being laughed at when asked to show a guard that your molar just broke in half with one part in your hand and the other profusely bleeding? I'll ask the dentist for an emergency visit. Paperwork came back for a visit in 6 months. Fuck Fresno County Jail. Done 11 years myself. One of the worst things I've seen is 2 members of a gang called Goodfellas, aka 40 deep, jumped on a blood on the way back from bill call. One used a large knife, the other had a fan motor in a net bag, and used that as a flail. Also seen/heard multiple people being raped. A friend of mine admitted to me after a year or so that he had been actively raped every night by his roommate, a ROOG from the Bloods, for about a 5-month period. There's more, just what I could think of. ATM. As a corrections officer, I've responded to, and in some cases prevented, suicides, typically by hanging, but sometimes cutting wrists. Stabbing and beatings take place, of course. There is always someone angry at someone. Fighting and bloody attacks at my facility were about once per week. Rape is less common than movies suggest, but there is very likely a sex for service trade going on somewhere, and every few months, 2 to 3 times a year, an inmate would use the tip line to report sexual abuse by another inmate. My uncle was in for 17 years for marijuana-related charges. He was in a ward with 2 other guys with the same name as him, both of them in for 7 years. One of them killed a guy and the other was a child molester. One day when my uncle was in the showers, a group of guys who mistaken him as a child molester were about to serve prison justice on the wrong guy. He quickly realized the situation, sprinted naked out the showers, to grab his papers, to show the guys they have the wrong dude. I've been into one charge, just transferred from a low to medium security, to get into a program. The low, overall was a crap hole. Bad food, technically overcrowded but it wasn't that bad. Lots of loud mouths, but no violence that I saw when I was there. The medium, however, that was a different story. Good food, looked more like a college campus, no overcrowding, scores of pool tables, saw a guy get stabbed in the head, never saw so much blood in my life. The groundkeepers kept that place immaculate. Saw 2 guys fight and topple over my tower of cereal. One, kinda soft white guy, got knocked down and had his face smashed in by a jacked up black guy. Oh yeah, we had unlimited soda fountain use in the mess hall. I spent 2 weeks awaiting trial in Johannesburg Central Prison. Saw a guy with mental issues get severely beaten one night after he attacked another inmate. Saw another guy have a kettle of boiling water poured over him another evening after an argument with another prisoner. In both cases the wardens did nothing until the following morning. I was lucky I managed to avoid any issues while I was there. Overall a crappy experience, 0 tenths, would not recommend. I made a friend early on who was sentenced to life for killing a man that had touched his niece. He'd been locked up for about 5 or 6 years when I'd first met him. Talked to him every day for 3 years, and one day he comes up to me and says he needs to talk to me about something. We do a lap on the back 40 and he tells me his old lady is leaving him and isn't bringing his daughter up to come see him anymore. He's actually crying. I didn't know what I could do to help him, so I let him cry and told him to not let it bother him, maybe she'll come around. We go on about our day and everything seems normal. That night he woke me up. He bunked across the hall, crying. I got up to talk to him, and he says he wants to die, and that he's glad I'm up, because he doesn't want to be alone. I start hitting the panic button for my cell, and screaming for a guard, but no one comes, and I have to watch, while he pries his mirror off of his wall. He put on his linens and blanket like a big robe, and he cuts his stomach with his mirror. It was hard to see much, because of the blankets and the dark, but I could smell his blood. Then he lit his blankets on fire. The coast got there when the smoke alarm went off, but they were too late. I still have nightmares about it, screaming for him to stop, to just talk it out, but he never does. I've seen a lot of fucked up shit, man, but this was probably the worst. Or, at least, it stuck with me the longest. Not prison but jail. 6 months pregnant and her water broke. Coast didn't believe her and waited to take her to the hospital until she was hemorrhaging. The baby died and the woman was released because they didn't want to pay medical costs. This was 2004-ish. I did a year spread out over a few 2 yards in as low-level yards. I didn't see much that really shocked me. I'd been on the street prior to being locked up, so anything I saw happen in prison was more of the same really. There were fights and people catching heat from their own people for fucking up and breaking rules, but for the most part it was fairly tame. I think the part that sticks with me the most is the amount of very clearly mentally ill people who were locked up with me, but were getting no help whatsoever. I mean, none of us were really getting any help, but some of these guys were clearly going to have no option when they left, except to go back to what they were doing. To me, that was the worst thing I saw, the absolute apathy of the system as a whole. I was incarcerated with 1,200 other inmates on 1 yard in Tuscan, in a complex that had I believe 7 or 8 other yards on it. This is of course one of many complexes in AS. This also came as a shock to me when I really thought about it, just the incredible amount of people being locked up. Most of the people I did time with were in for non-violent, drug-related offenses. TW. Rape. One time I was being transferred from a medium security facility to a minimum security facility because I'd earned it after staying out of trouble. For some reason we could only get about halfway there, so we had to stay overnight in a maximum security prison along the way. This place was run down, poorly funded, smelly, dungeon-like. Not at all like the facility we were coming from or heading to. We were only there overnight, but I'll never forget the terror-filled screams that woke us in the middle of the night as some guy was fighting for his life. Guards didn't do anything for a really long time and we all could hear this guy getting the crap beat out of him and raped. It was really awful. We could just hear it all, like he was begging for his life. He started off tough and strong, and by the end just, man. That was the only time I ever saw or heard of anything like that happening in real life. Most of what happens in movies is not at all how it is IRL. There was a gang of queer black men that was known to be the most violent if crossed. Well, one day after a card game, a fellow inmate verbally disrespected one of the members. That inmate was followed to the bathroom by 3 members of the gang later that day, a black eye and 2 missing teeth later. He's telling people that he slipped in the shower. I'm sure the officers knew that he was beaten, but he would not admit it. Moral of the story, never underestimate someone or disrespect someone with words that you can't defend. I went to a YO as a teen, and easily the worst thing, knowing many of the people I met in there would probably be spending the majority or the rest of their lives behind bars. Some weren't bad people, some just didn't have a good start in life, no education, not known a different way to live. I still wonder where some of them are today 20 years later. I have been to state prison, but the worst things I saw were in county jail. While on a high bail block, a teen came in for lighting fire in Iroquoisdale at the mall. He was definitely mentally handicapped, perhaps autistic. They put him in a cell with a guy who killed a woman in the 80s and was only in county for parole hearing. That night the block endured horrible screams as poor kid's virginity was taken. The next morning at chow was the most quiet I ever heard. Kid was taken to medical after chow. I asked a correction officer friend a similar question. He told me the worst type of offenders were the bugs. He observed one guy who had sliced open his stomach and was actively pulling out his intestines. My friend couldn't do anything but observe before they could assemble a team to safely subdue the inmate. Not me, but my brother. He always had substance abuse problems and depression. It was obvious he needed professional help, and what he got instead was over 7 years of his life lost to jail and prison. Stabbings. He's seen it. Rape. Seen it. Overdoses. Assaults. Lack of medical treatment. Guards beat a guy almost to death for talking back. Inmates forced to rub hot sauce on their dicks by co's. Made to fight each other. Seen it all, but the worst part is how my brother almost died from an infection in his lungs. And when he asked for help, struggling to breathe and stand upright, the nurse and officers called him a liar and charged him $50 for a false medical visit. He collapsed and almost died before he was taken to a hospital, and nobody was punished. Nobody lost their job, and when he did get out he had to pay court costs, fines, bills, maintenance for house arrest device, and a million other things, and he did it all, and is now a law-abiding citizen with most of his rights restored. But try telling that to anyone hiring for a job. My cousin is locked up right now, and I can guarantee it's all still the same in this hellhole state, NC. When I think of what my brother and many others had to go through alone when what they needed was help, it makes me cry. My family has done a lot of Bible study and preaching in the Texas and New Mexico penitentiary systems. I remember a time where someone was stabbed during a sermon with a toilet paper shiv. They took toilet paper and got it wet and molded it into a knife and sharpened it once it dried. My dad is a prison guard. He worked a night shift once, which was based on the wings. I was eating breakfast when my dad came home and he was shaking. Turns out a prisoner set himself on fire inside his cell, and my dad basically watched him burn from the other side whilst he waited for the guard in the room at the end of the wing to open the door. Pretty heavy shit. Things I've seen, and some things that I know happened. Spice, NPS, attacks, where they would turn into the Hulk. Seen one guy meowing and crawling around, but most turn into a zombie too. Seen a guy fitting as he didn't get a benzodiazepine detox, and he went from 100mg plus to nothing. I had hold his head as it was smashing into the floor. 3. Female officers shagging inmates. 4. Officers bringing phones and drugs into prison. 5. Female officer getting kicked in the head. 6. Officers being potted, butts, shit and vomit thrown over someone. 7. Inmates throwing boiling suja water over other inmates and officers. 8. Bullying for other people's medication. I'm sure that I've forgotten some other things. so I actually work in one currently, and it's probably pertaining to the mental health crisis. No matter how many times you do your checks, which can be one-on-one supervision for a shift, to 15 to 30 checks of your block, if they wanna die they will kill themselves. People hung up with sheets, smacking their head into the walls or cutting up. It can be a very bloody mess, no matter how on your game you are. There was talk about a guy assaulting his own daughter. Some guys made him a cup of morning coffee. Morning coffee is basically taking a kettle, pour cooking oil in it, heat it up, and add a lot of sugar, and then throw it in someone's face. It was very uncomfortable to see and hear. Honestly, it was just the amount of people in there who never had a fucking chance. People who were pipelined straight into the situation they were currently in by every adult in their lives and truly couldn't have made a single different choice. People who were scared and incapable of helping themselves because they didn't understand what the legal system was doing to them, and they didn't have anyone on the outside. Many American prisoners here. Yeah, maybe prison reform isn't too bad of an idea for you. Compared to Europe, and people actually exit prisons as changed people, but in a positive way. I know plenty of people who were just legit losers doing small time crime out of boredom, went to prison, and when they left they all suddenly started new jobs and earned their own living. I know a guy who used to be a corrections officer for a state maximum security place. He didn't often tell any details about his job, but the worst thing he ever mentioned to me was seeing someone get their head kicked in, literally, during a riot or fight. The aftermath being that a round skull wasn't round anymore and the stuff that's supposed to be inside was outside. I try not to think about it, but this thread reminded me. Not in prison, but work at a hospital that treats prisoners. Plenty of inmates swallowing handfuls of razor blades. Grossest thing so far was a pedophile who ripped off his dick and balls with his bare hands and almost bled to death. One of the nurses who has worked there for a long time told me a story about a guy who ripped out both his eyeballs with his bare hands and ate them. Never been, but my friend next to me just got released after a 9-year stint. He said the worst one he saw was when the whites did a removal. It's where one of them fucks up bad enough they try to kill him. He said they were told ahead of time by the main guy for the whites out of respect. Guy manages to get the corner of one of those metal vent covers and proceeds to stab the removal in the kidneys 3 times, then in the throat and upper chest, too many to count. Guy was still stabbing after getting hit with mace and a rubber bullet. Removal's last words were, "You got the wrong guy." Spent a year in a Thai prison and honestly the worst behavior was from the guards. I did see a couple of fights between the prisoners, but anyone that breaks prison rules is put in heavy chains for 90 days and then routinely beaten by the guards out on the rec field. Like clockwork, every weekend they would line up the prisoners, get them on their hands and knees and just beat them with their batons. Probably the worst thing I witnessed was this Polish kid who got bullied so bad he lost his mind. He ended up trying to jump off the building. So of course the logical thing was to give him punishment and 90 days in heavy chains with mandatory exercise every day. And don't forget the beatings. Not prison, but I used to work as a teacher in a psychiatric hospital for young people. I once saw a girl crack her head open by repeatedly headbutting the corner of her shelves in her room. We had to restrain her to stop her hurting herself, while me and my colleague were covered in blood from the incident. Absolutely the worst things I've ever seen or been involved in.